A waitress was pushed into a pool. Everyone laughed. Then a billionaire stepped in and left everyone stunned. What if one moment of cruelty could change everything? Grace wiped down the last table at the country club's poolside restaurant, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished stone. At 34 years old, she'd been serving the wealthy members of Riverside Country Club for 3 years, invisible to most, except when they needed their drinks refilled. The summer heat still hung in the air even as evening approached, and the pool area buzzed with laughter from a private graduation party. Grace had learned to smile through anything. The rude looks, the tiny tips, the way some guests spoke about her like she wasn't standing right there. But tonight felt different somehow, heavier, like the thick air before a storm. She tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear and balanced the tray of empty glasses, just wanting to finish her shift and get home to her 8-year-old daughter. She had no idea that in just a few minutes, her entire world would shift in ways she never could have imagined. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Grace had always been the kind of person who tried to see the good in everyone, even when they made it difficult. Tonight's party was for Charlotte Penton, a local judge's daughter who just graduated from law school. The poolside terrace sparkled with string lights, and expensive champagne flowed freely among the 20-something crowd. "Excuse me, waitress," called Charlotte from her spot by the pool's edge. Grace approached with a practiced smile, noting how the young woman's designer dress probably cost more than Grace made in 2 months. "We need more champagne, and make sure it's the good stuff this time." The dismissive tone stung, but Grace simply nodded as she headed toward the bar. Grace overheard Charlotte talking to her friends. "Did you see her shoes? I can't believe they let the help dress like that. Daddy should really talk to management about standards." The group burst into laughter, and Grace felt her cheeks burn. At the bar, Grace took a deep breath and reminded herself why she was here. Every shift brought her closer to saving enough for her daughter, Lily's school supplies, and maybe even a small birthday party next month. The bartender, Frank, noticed her expression. "Rough crowd tonight?" he asked gently. Grace managed a weak smile. "Nothing I can't handle." She loaded the champagne onto her tray and walked back toward the pool. When she approached their table, Charlotte was in the middle of a story about how her father had cleaned house at the courthouse. "Sometimes you just have to remind people where they belong," Charlotte said. Grace set down the champagne bottles carefully, but as she turned to leave, Charlotte's voice stopped her cold. "Actually, waitress, there's something spilled near my chair. Be a dear and clean it up, won't you?" Grace looked down and saw nothing but clean stone, but she knelt anyway, pretending to wipe the area. The humiliation felt thick in her throat, but she needed this job. As Grace stood up, she noticed a man sitting alone at a corner table she hadn't seen before. He was perhaps 42 years old, dressed simply in khakis and a button-down shirt, watching the scene with quiet intensity. Unlike the other guests, he didn't look away when their eyes met, instead offering a small, sympathetic smile. Charlotte's voice grew louder as she told her friends another story. "So I told the barista. Do you know who my father is? You should have seen how quickly she remade my latte." Charlotte stood up, swaying slightly from the champagne. "Some people need to learn their place in this world." Grace tried to focus on her work, but when she passed by again, Charlotte suddenly grabbed her arm. "Wait, I have an idea for some fun. It's so hot tonight and you look absolutely exhausted. What do you say we help you cool off?" Before Grace could respond, Charlotte's boyfriend, Jake, jumped up, grinning. "Oh, this is perfect." Grace backed away, but she was surrounded now by 5 of Charlotte's friends. "Please, I need to get back to work," Grace said quietly. Frank, the bartender, looked over with concern, but he was trapped behind the bar. The mysterious man in the corner had stopped eating and was now watching intently, his expression growing darker. Grace felt trapped as Charlotte and her friends closed in around her. "Come on, don't be such a spoil sport," Charlotte said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "It's just a little fun. Besides, your uniform could probably use a wash anyway." The insult hit Grace like a physical blow. She thought about Lily at home, probably doing homework, trusting that mommy would come home with enough tip money for groceries tomorrow. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up. The tension reached a breaking point as Charlotte nodded to Jake, and Grace realized with horror what was about to happen. She was just steps away from the pool's edge with nowhere to run, as 20 people watched and waited. Jake lunged forward and shoved Grace hard in the chest. She stumbled backward, arms spinning as she tried to catch her balance, but gravity won. Grace hit the chlorinated water with a splash that echoed across the terrace. The cold shock knocked the breath from her lungs as she sank beneath the surface. When she finally came up, gasping and sputtering, the sound that greeted her was worse than the cold water. Laughter, not just from Charlotte's group, but from other guests who had gathered to watch. Grace treaded water in her soaked uniform, mascara running down her cheeks, feeling more humiliated than she'd ever felt in her life. "Oh my God, that was priceless," Charlotte squealed, pulling out her phone. "This is definitely going on social media." The crowd laughed even harder, and Grace felt something break inside her chest. She looked around desperately for a ladder, but they were on the far side of the pool. "Hey, while you're in there, maybe you can clean the pool." "Two," someone called out, triggering another wave of cruel laughter. Grace's hands finally found the pool's edge, but her wet fingers slipped on the smooth stone as she tried to pull herself up. That's when she heard a voice cut through the laughter like a knife. "That's enough." The tone was quiet, but carried an authority that made every person fall silent. Grace looked up to see the man from the corner table walking purposefully toward the pool, his face set in controlled fury. He knelt down and extended his hand. "Let me help you." Something in his voice made Grace trust him instantly. She grasped his hand and he pulled her up with surprising strength, steadying her as she stood dripping on the stone. Without a word, he took off his shirt and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly, his eyes full of genuine concern. Grace shook her head, though she was trembling from cold and shock. Charlotte started to protest. "Hey, we were just having some fun." But the man's gaze turned to her with such intensity that she actually took a step backward. "Have you ever faced something like this? Let us know in the comments." Grace wrapped the shirt tighter around herself, grateful for this unexpected kindness. But she could see in his eyes that this was far from over, and Charlotte seemed to sense it too, her cocky smile finally starting to fade. The man stepped forward, his voice carrying across the silent terrace. "What I just witnessed was assault. You deliberately pushed this woman into a pool, and then you humiliated her while she was helpless." Charlotte tried to laugh it off, but it came out as a nervous giggle. It was just a joke. Everyone was having fun. Everyone? The man looked around at the crowd, many of whom were now staring at their phones or finding their drinks very interesting. This woman was working, trying to earn money to support her family, and you thought it would be amusing to assault her for entertainment. Charlotte's father, Judge Penton, appeared from the restaurant. "What seems to be the trouble here?" Charlotte immediately brightened, thinking her father would handle this stranger. "Daddy, this man is making a big deal out of nothing. We were just playing around with the waitress." The mysterious man reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to Judge Penton. As the judge read it, his face went completely white. He looked up at the man, then back at the card, then at his daughter with growing horror. "Charlotte, do you have any idea who this is?" Charlotte shrugged, still defiant. "Some random guy who needs to mind his own business." But Judge Penton was already moving toward Grace, his hands shaking. "Miss, I am so terribly sorry for what happened here tonight." The mysterious man spoke again, his voice still eerily calm. "My name is Daniel Sterling. I own Sterling Industries, and as of last month I also own this country club." The collective gasp from the crowd was audible. Even Grace recognized that name. Sterling Industries was one of the largest companies in the state. Charlotte's face went from confident to confused to terrified in seconds. That's impossible," she stammered. "You're dressed like—" Daniel's smile was cold as winter, like someone who judges people by their character instead of their bank account. He turned to Grace, his expression softening immediately. "Ma'am, I'd like to offer you my sincere apology for what you've experienced here tonight. This behavior is not what this establishment represents, and there will be immediate consequences." Then he addressed the crowd. "Anyone who participated in or encouraged what happened here tonight is banned from this property, permanently. If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales." The stunned silence was broken only by security guards' footsteps as they approached. Grace stood there in Daniel's shirt, watching as the people who had laughed at her humiliation just minutes before now scrambled to distance themselves from Charlotte. Daniel turned back to Grace with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the authority he'd just displayed. "Let's get you somewhere warm and dry," he said, guiding her toward the main building. "I'm truly sorry you had to experience that. No one should ever be treated that way, especially not while working hard to make an honest living." In the manager's office, Grace changed into dry clothes. When she emerged, she found Daniel waiting with hot tea and a concerned expression. "Are you feeling better?" Grace nodded, though she was still processing everything. "I don't understand why you helped me," she said quietly. "You don't even know me." Daniel smiled, and for the first time that evening, it reached his eyes. "My mother was a waitress when I was growing up. She worked 3 jobs to keep food on our table. I've never forgotten where I came from or how hard some people have to work just to survive." He paused, looking out at the now empty pool area. "People like Charlotte think money gives them the right to treat others as less than human. They're wrong." He turned back to Grace with a serious expression. "I want to offer you a position at my company's headquarters. It's an office job with full benefits, paid time off, and a salary that's more than triple what you're making here. You'd also have opportunities for advancement." Grace's eyes filled with tears of overwhelming gratitude. "But why?" she whispered. "You saw how I was treated tonight." Daniel shook his head firmly. "What I saw was a woman who maintained her dignity and professionalism even when faced with cruelty. You didn't fight back, you didn't lose your temper, and you didn't let them break your spirit. Those are exactly the qualities I value." 3 months later, Grace sat in her new office overlooking the city, helping coordinate the company's charitable foundation. She'd been able to move Lily to a better school district, and for the first time in years, she wasn't worried about making rent. Sometimes she thought about that night at the pool, not with bitterness but with gratitude. Daniel had become not just her employer, but a friend and mentor who reminded her that kindness was a choice, and that true strength came from lifting others up, rather than tearing them down. Charlotte had been arrested for assault, while Judge Penton had quietly stepped down from the bench. But perhaps the most beautiful part was what Grace had learned about herself. That she was worthy of respect, kindness, and opportunity, not because someone powerful decided to help her, but because she had always possessed those qualities within herself. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Sometimes the most extraordinary changes come from the simplest acts of human decency.